There was a man who spent 30 years winning everything. The estate was his, the debts of revenge were settled, and every single person who had wronged him had fallen. Then he sat alone in that house and started calling out a name. The woman had been dead for 18 years. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't sleep. In that empty room, he called her name over and over again until he himself no longer knew who he was calling for. That love which turned you into a demon, was it true love or obsession? This story may not give you an answer, but it can give you a mirror. You might just recognize a face in that mirror. Hello everyone, I'm Fanko, and welcome to Fanko's Character Intelligence Library. Today, we're going to talk about Wuthering Heights. But before we dive into the story itself, we need to first step into the life of this book's author, Emily Bront. Are you ready? Let's get started. December 1848. Haworth Village, Yorkshire, England. A coffin was carried out of the parsonage. The coffin measured just 16 inches wide. The undertaker, William Wood, would later say that in a lifetime of making coffins, he had never seen an adult's coffin so narrow. He recorded the measurements in the ledger, and beneath them wrote, Emily Jane Bronte, aged 30. It was her. The very woman who wrote Wuthering Heights. Her name was Emily Bronte. Born the 30th of July, 1818. Died the 19th of December, 1848. For 30 years, tuberculosis burned through her body until she wasted away to nothing so frail that even a coffin couldn't be filled by what remained of her. But the fire she made in this world 30 years, 170 years later, it still burns. How could a woman who had never once been in love write the most blazingly passionate love story in all of literary history? How did she, having lived only 30 years and left behind a single novel, manage to permanently reshape the landscape of English literature? Why is it that her name and her book are still being opened again and again today by millions of readers around the world? The answer lies in the wind sweeping across the Yorkshire moors. Emily's father, Patrick Bronte, was a poor country clergyman, born in 1777 and died in 1861, living to the age of 84. He served as a parish priest for most of his life in the village of Haworth, deep within the moorlands of Yorkshire. It was a place of relentless winds, heavy winter snows, and miles of open road to the nearest town. The cemetery lay beside the garden, death and life dwelling side by side. The village's drinking well stood just a few steps from the public cemetery. The locals drank water contaminated by decomposing corpses, and tuberculosis spread into an endemic plague. Haworth, a place where one could only breathe in the stench of death. And it was here, in this very place, that Emily spent all 30 years of her life. This father holds a suffocating record. He outlived his wife and all 6 of his children, burying the young with his own aged hands, again and again, for the rest of his life. When his wife Maria passed away in 1821, their oldest child was just 7 years old, and the youngest was only 1. Patrick raised 6 children alone, out on the moors, in the dim study of the parsonage. He was a stern father who prized self-discipline and held his children to a standard of daily conduct that bordered on the severe. He forbade them from eating meat, believing it would stoke the passions. He forced them to endure a spare, austere way of life through the bitter cold. 6 children, compelled from an early age to rely on no one but each other. They told each other stories. They invented imaginary kingdoms, where they conjured up kings and wars, love and death. These have been extensively documented by researchers. Charlotte and Branwell created Angria. Emily and Anne created Gondal, an imagined empire filled with fierce winds, wild moorlands, and burning passion. Emily wrote an enormous body of poetry for Gondal poems, filled with characters whose emotions burned so fierce They nearly scorched the page. In her imagination, she had died 1,000 deaths, loved 1,000 souls, and lived through everything that her real life had never given her. She rarely left Haworth in her lifetime. The one time she went to Brussels to study, she came back in less than a year, homesick. The moors were her world, and her material. They kept writing and writing, until they wrote themselves into literary history. Patrick's eldest son Branwell died on September 24, 1848, at the age of 31. Alcohol and opium had hollowed him out completely, a man who once had the makings of a true artist. Branwell had once been the child upon whom the family placed their highest hopes. His father Patrick sent him to study painting and music. It was believed he would be the one to carry the Bronte name out into the world. Yet, after a failed love affair, he descended into self-destruction. Legend has it that Branwell vowed to die on his feet, and according to those who were present, he did indeed spend his final hours standing as he passed from this world. This account was recorded by Elizabeth Gaskell in her biography, The Life of Charlotte Bronte. However, the editors of the Dictionary of National Biography questioned this account, suggesting it was more likely a family anecdote that had been romanticized over time. 3 months later, Emily followed her brother into death. On her final day, she refused to see a doctor. That morning, she still insisted on combing her hair and feeding the pigeons. It wasn't until noon that she finally agreed to let a doctor come. Her dog, Keeper, lay at the door for several days before finally accepting that his mistress would never return. The guardian came to the doorway of the bedroom where Emily had once slept, lay across the threshold, and howled for many days. Charlotte later wrote, "Keeper still visits Emily's little bedroom every day." On the 28th of May, 1849, little sister Anne passed away in Charlotte's arms at just 29 years old, taken by the same disease, tuberculosis. Her last words were, "Charlotte, take courage." On March 31st, 1855, Charlotte passed away exactly 3 weeks before her 39th birthday. It was the last spring she would ever know. All 3 Bronte sisters died before the age of 40. Patrick stood before the coffin once and again and again. The father who lived to 84 carried, through his long years, every loss this family had ever known. In this family's unending history of loss and burial, Emily was a strange anomaly. She never feared death, yet she refused to let it take what she loved without a fight. According to Elizabeth Gaskell's biography, Emily was said to be the most beautiful of the 3 sisters and an exceptional cook. She loved to roll dough in the kitchen while reciting poetry from memory, and she had a remarkable affinity for animals. She could hold the gaze of a wild stray dog until it finally lowered its head in submission. Her sister Charlotte was terrified of livestock, and Emily would deliberately take her to see them, then smile with quiet satisfaction as Charlotte screamed. This kind of indifference to fear was almost instinctive for her. In her youth, she was once bitten by a rabid dog. She didn't cry out. She walked into the kitchen alone, pulled a pair of red-hot fire tongs from behind the stove, and pressed them directly onto the wound. Through the whole thing, she didn't make a sound. Only afterward did she tell the rest of the family. This incident later made its way into her sister Charlotte's novel Times. Shirley, the heroine, Shirley Keeldar, is bitten by a mad dog and slips away to the kitchen alone to cauterize the wound herself, refusing any help from others. The prototype for that character was Emily herself. What kind of love could someone so indifferent to pain possibly write? This is the person who wrote Wuthering Heights. In December 1847, the novel was published under the name Ellis Bell, a masculine pen name. The 3 sisters chose to publish under pen names because, as Charlotte later explained, authors who wrote as women were often looked upon with a prejudiced eye. Getting the book published was no easy task. Charlotte hustled through the streets of London, negotiating deals, writing letters to publishers, pooling together the three sisters' manuscript fees to fund the publication themselves. Emily had little part in any of this. She stayed in Haworth, walking her own paths across the moors, writing her poems. The book came out. The critics nearly universally threw it to the ground. One reviewer wrote, "Whether this book was written by the living or the dead, it is a mixture of vulgarity, depravity, and supernatural horror. Why did the author not put an end to herself before setting pen to paper?" Looking back at those words today, the irony is almost too rich. Wuthering Heights had a first print run of just 250 copies, sold almost nothing, and was met with widespread contempt. The moral guardians of the Victorian era deemed its portrayal of emotion far too extreme an affront to civilized society. No one believed that this unsettling book would one day become an eternal classic in the history of literature. Yet in 2015, the BBC invited 82 prominent literary critics from around the world to select the 100 greatest British novels. Wuthering Heights ranked 7th on the list. Then on January 20th, 1978, a song called Wuthering Heights was released. The singer was Kate Bush, 19 years old, born on the 30th of July, 1958, the same month and day as Emily Bronte. She poured herself into the soul of Catherine Earnshaw. The song hit #1 on the UK singles chart, holding that position for 4 weeks. Kate Bush thus became the first female artist in the United Kingdom to reach #1 with a song she had written entirely on her own. The melody of that song came from the moors, from a soul she had never seen. A woman who died at 30, yet the power she created has crossed 2 centuries. Virginia Woolf once wrote, "Wuthering Heights is a more difficult book to understand than Jane Eyre, because Emily was a greater poet than Charlotte. And now, let us step into the world she wrote with her very life." Late 18th century, the moorlands of Yorkshire in the north of England. There is a place called Wuthering Heights. Wuthering is no metaphor. That was the local climate, fierce winds blowing year-round, howling without stop, strong enough to bend every tree in sight. The manor stood at the hilltop, exposed on all sides, with weathered stone carvings embedded in the window frames that had been there for ages. 1,500. This house had outlived every generation that ever walked its halls. It had witnessed love, hatred, death. It had witnessed everything. It simply stood there in silence, letting the wind pass through, letting people come and go. The master of the estate, Mr. Earnshaw, had 2 children, a son named Hindley and a daughter named Catherine. One day, the old Master Earnshaw returned from Liverpool, carrying a child of unknown origin, dark-skinned, dirty and disheveled, speaking a language no one could understand. So hungry, his eyes had gone wild. The master set him down on the floor and said, "I've brought him home. We'll call him Heathcliff." This was around 1771, when Liverpool stood at the height of the Atlantic slave trade. At that time, 80% of Britain's slave ships sailed out of Liverpool. Tens of thousands of enslaved Africans were shipped through its docks every year. On the streets of this city, orphans and drifters from every corner of the world wandered, their fates hanging by a thread. No one knew where this child had come from, and no one knew his real name. The master gave him a son's name and showered him with exceptional affection, even more than he gave his own flesh and blood. This favoritism had its own logic. The master was a man who believed in accumulating merit through good deeds, and he was convinced that bringing this dying child home was a mission entrusted to him by God. The more everyone opposed it, the more he dug in his heels, because admitting he was wrong meant admitting his judgment had been flawed from from the very start. Hindley despised this rival who had appeared out of nowhere. Catherine fell in love with this boy whose soul was as wild as her own. That is where this story begins. When Heathcliff first arrived, the entire Earnshaw household rejected him. His wife assumed the dark-skinned boy was her husband's bastard child from some affair outside the marriage, and could barely bring herself to acknowledge his existence. Hindley seized every chance to torment him, and the children treated him like an unwelcome intruder. But Heathcliff had a peculiar gift. He could endure. Not the endurance of cowardice, but a silence-hardened kind of endurance, like a stone soaking in water, smooth on the surface, growing denser and denser within. This can be seen in a small incident. Old Earnshaw once bought each of the two children a horse from the market. Heathcliff chose the prettier one first, but the prettier horse soon went lame. When Heathcliff noticed, he quietly went to Hindley and said, "Swap your horse with mine, or I'll tell father you've beaten me 3 times this week." Hindley gave him another beating, but fearing the threat of being reported, he handed over the healthy horse in exchange. Heathcliff shrugged it off immediately, as if nothing had happened, completely unbothered by the bruises on his body. The housekeeper Nellie watched all this and made a mental note. As long as Heathcliff got what he wanted, he didn't care what it cost him. This child carried no grievances in his head, only a ledger of debts. To ease the tension in the household, Master Earnshaw sent Hindley away to school. As Hindley left, he buried his hatred for Heathcliff in the deepest corner of his heart, like a poisoned seed. Without Hindley to rein them in, Heathcliff and Catherine ran wild across the moors. In summer, they chased the wind, barefoot, through the heather. In winter, they would lie in the haystacks trading stories, counting the stars overhead. They were cut from the same cloth, wild, fierce, indifferent to the rules of the civilized world, yet utterly devoted to each other. If anyone wanted to punish Catherine, the most effective way was to keep her away from Heathcliff. Everyone in the household knew that. Catherine was a beautiful, willful little girl, her spirit forever surging like the tide restless, unstoppable with the most captivating eyes you had ever seen. She was a spirit of the moors, and yet a wild, wicked slip. Even her dying father, gazing at her in his final moments, couldn't help but say, "Cathy, why can't you just be a good girl, always?" Cathy smiled and said, "Daddy, why can't you always be a good man?" And with that, she kissed his hand at once and began to hum softly to herself. She could wield both sharp claws and tenderness at once, and never knew which one she was using at any given moment. After old Mr. Earnshaw passed away, Hindley returned with his new bride, Frances, to attend the funeral and take over Wuthering Heights. Frances was a girl from the outside world, carrying with her the frivolous refinement of city life, and she had been consumptive from the very moment she appeared. Her fragility stood in sharp contrast to Catherine's sweeping, elemental force out on the moors. She didn't like Heathcliff, but her provocations were subtle. Roundabout, she simply lit a fire in Hindley's heart, then stepped back and let Hindley burn on his own. Hindley's hatred, pent up for years, finally broke through the dam. The first thing he did, strip Heathcliff of his status as an adopted son and reduce him to a servant. No schooling, no place at the dinner table, only field labor and a bed of hay. From that point on, Heathcliff turned completely feral, his clothes caked in mud, his hair wild as a thorn bush, the calluses on his hands growing thicker by the day. But his eyes never lost their light. It was during this time that something happened, something that would change the fate of everyone involved. One night, Heathcliff and Catherine sneaked over to the neighboring Thrushcross Grange and pressed themselves against the window, peering inside. Golden light seeped through the window's edge, falling on 2 young faces that turned to meet each other in silence. Inside, Edgar and Isabella, the Linton siblings, were locked in a scuffle over a little dog. A deep red carpet, a white ceiling, a glass chandelier trimmed with gold. It was another world entirely refined, gentle, and governed by rules. Edgar and Isabella, though older than Heathcliff and Catherine, were there squabbling and crying over a little dog, utterly childish, as if they'd never known a moment of hardship. Heathcliff said, "Not for 1,000 lives would I trade places with them." He said this not out of poverty, but out of a pride that ran bone deep. He held nothing but contempt for a life lived under glass-sheltered, coddled, blind to how brutal this world truly is. But fate gave Catherine a cruel shove. The Lintons' guard dog lunged and bit Catherine on the ankle. She did not cry out. She only clenched her teeth and let it bite. The Linton family came running at the commotion, recognized the young miss from Wuthering Heights, and kept her at the Grange to recover from her wound. Heathcliff was turned away. The reason given was that he was of low birth and unfit to enter a respectable household. What Mrs. Linton said to Catherine was this: "That child is a gypsy bastard, an abandoned wild thing, a spawn of the devil." 5 weeks later, Catherine returned to Wuthering Heights, a changed person entirely. She wore a fine dress, gloves, her hair neatly pinned up. The way she walked had changed, and her voice had grown softer. She had become a true lady of refinement. Civilization had polished her smooth, grinding away every trace of the wildness she once carried on the moors. Heathcliff stood where he was, watching her. His shirt had 3 tears in it, and the mud on him hadn't even dried. He didn't say a word. Catherine's feelings for him hadn't changed. The moment she saw him, she still flew into his arms and peppered him with 7 or 8 kisses. But her eyes kept darting back and forth between his blackened, grimy fingers and her own beautiful dress. She kept a watchful eye on his dirty hands, afraid he might leave smudges on her dress. But what Heathcliff saw was something else entirely. He had become someone unworthy of touching her. The seed of hatred was planted in that moment. That night, Catherine sought out the housekeeper, Nellie. She had something to say, something she had kept buried in her heart for a long time. Catherine said, "My love for Edgar is like the leaves on the trees. When winter comes, it will change, it will fall away." She paused, then went on, "But my love for Heathcliff is the eternal rock beneath my feet. It holds little visible joy, yet it is the very foundation of my being. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. Only he remains, and I am still myself. If everything else remained, and only he were destroyed, the entire universe would become a vast and alien place, and I would no longer be a part of it." Then she said those words that would be quoted by countless people ever after. "Nellie, I am Heathcliff." She loved him, down to the very marrow of her bones. But she also admitted that marrying him would mean demeaning herself. Her love for Linton Heathcliff was a different kind of real. He was young, handsome, gentle, and wealthy, someone who could give her dignity, someone who could make her the most distinguished woman in the region. She wanted both kinds of love. Her plan was this: marry Edgar Linton, use his wealth to lift Heathcliff out of poverty and misery, and give all 3 of them a good life. She thought this was the perfect solution, a plan that would serve everyone well. What she didn't know was that someone had heard only half of what she said. Heathcliff was just outside the door. He heard Catherine say that marrying him would be beneath her. He did not hear the rocks, did not hear the same stuff, did not hear, "I am Heathcliff." He never heard her say she would use Linton's money to help him. He only caught that half of a sentence, and then he turned and walked away into that stormy night, leaving Wuthering Heights behind. What permanently altered the fates of 2 people was the half of the sentence that went unheard. This is the cruelest narrative stroke in Wuthering Heights. A love broken apart by a single misunderstanding. Not betrayal, not a lack of love, just a single sentence, heard only halfway through. Catherine searched for him like a woman possessed, crying out into the storm through an entire night, to no avail. She fell gravely ill, hovering at the edge of death. The kind-hearted Lintons took her in at Thrushcross Grange to nurse her back to health, and in doing so, contracted the fever themselves. Both of them died. Their goodwill came at the cost of their lives. 3 years later, Linton married Catherine, and in this marriage, Linton was sincere. He cherished Catherine deeply. There is a heartbreaking line in the book: he would rather be stabbed with a small knife than see Catherine troubled. Would hurt him more than being stabbed himself. He was a good husband, considerate, restrained, never raising his voice, giving her every comfort and tenderness he had. And that was precisely the problem. Catherine did not need tenderness. She needed wind, needed that kind of force that could bend a tree to the ground. After the marriage, Catherine became the mistress of the Grange, living a respectable life. But she confided to Nellie in private, "The Grange is heaven. But I do not wish to stay here forever. It would suffocate me." Civilization was her cage. What she needed was the moors, that raw force capable of bending trees to its will, and Heathcliff. Linton gave her the finest the civilized world had to offer, while Heathcliff was the source of everything wild within her. Two things she could never possess at the same time. Catherine chose civilization, but her soul never left the moors. As for those 3 years, where did Heathcliff go? Emily never tells us. Not a single line explains where he went, what he endured, or how he transformed from a penniless servant into a well-dressed gentleman. The author tells us only this: 3 years later, he came back tall, composed, carrying himself with a bearing that surpassed even the elegant Edgar Linton. The change ran bone deep. Something that had been pressing against his heart for years had been ground into a blade. The moment Catherine laid eyes on him, she was overcome with wild, breathless joy. Hindley turned pale, his heart racing. Two men, two forces converging at once in one woman's life. Someone once described the contrast this way: as one man walked in from one side and the other walked out from the other, it was like a bleak and desolate coal country, all rolling barren hills. In an instant, it transformed into a lush and fertile valley. Heathcliff moved into the neighboring Wuthering Heights, and there he began to wait, biding his time for revenge. Meanwhile, Edgar's sister Isabella had fallen in love with him. It was a dangerous, blind kind of love. Isabella had grown up sheltered in the comfortable estate of Thrushcross Grange, raised on a steady diet of romantic novels. She imagined Heathcliff as a weathered, Byronic hero, convinced that somewhere beneath the surface lay a tenderness and chivalry waiting for her to awaken. She was in love with a man of her own imagination, Catherine warned her. She spoke with the kind of candid intimacy that comes from knowing Heathcliff better than anyone. Don't ever imagine that beneath that harsh exterior of his, there is no deep benevolence or tenderness buried beneath that stern exterior. He is not an uncut diamond, not an oyster concealing a pearl. He was a man as savage and merciless as a wolf, a barren wasteland, filled with nothing but jagged, brutal thorns and hard, unyielding stone. Only Catherine saw through to the very core of Heathcliff's soul and loved him still, because at their deepest nature they were the same. Her warning to Isabella was sincere, not jealousy. Isabella didn't hear a single word of it. She believed she was the one who could change him. Every person who was ultimately devoured by the monster had once believed exactly the same thing. Love, under certain conditions, can curdle into hatred. This is the central proposition of Time's Wuthering Heights Times, and the darkest insight Emily Bronte ever left to the world. Heathcliff returned, armed with his fortune and his hatred. He moved into Wuthering Heights and began laying his traps, exploiting the master Hindley's drinking and gambling. He lent Hindley money, egged him on to gamble big, and watched him lose the estate's deeds one by one. Hindley never once imagined that a servant he had beaten and abused every single day had already calculated his entire fortune into a chessboard of revenge. This was a revenge that was total, cold, and carried out with mathematical precision. Heathcliff did not drink, did not lose control, did not act on impulse. He simply waited, waiting for the man who once humiliated him to hand over everything with his own hands. Every defeat that Hindley suffered was Heathcliff's plan unfolding exactly as intended, one step at a time. Francis gave birth to a son named Hareton, then died of consumption not long after. Hindley, robbed of the woman he loved, became little more than a hollow shell that could hold its liquor. He paid almost no attention to his own son Hareton, at times threatening the servants with a knife, at other times nearly hurling the child off the upper floor. Wuthering Heights, in silence, slowly became Heathcliff's, not just Hindley. Hindley's son Hareton was drawn into the game as well. Heathcliff kept the boy close, forbidding him from schooling, denying him any education, and putting him to work alongside the servants in the fields, deliberately letting him grow into a rough, ignorant boy who couldn't even spell his own name. This was his way of revenge. Whatever was done to me, I'll pass that same fate down to your bloodline. Suffering became an inheritance, handed down from one generation to the next. But revenge has a way of biting back in ways you never expect. One night, a drunken Hindley hurled little Hareton over the upstairs railing. Heathcliff caught the child on instinct, reaching out without thinking. Then he saw the face and froze. He realized he had just sabotaged his own revenge. Hareton was supposed to die at Hindley's hands. That would have been the perfect ending. He hated himself for the kindness he'd shown. It was the last remnant of humanity buried deep within him, the very humanity he despised in himself. Even more remarkable, Hareton, the very child he had deliberately crushed underfoot, actually worshipped Heathcliff. Because compared to his biological father, who drank all day and came at him with a knife, Heathcliff at least made him feel that some kind of order existed in the world. A child's loyalty can sometimes run deeper than an adult's, and all the more heartbreaking for it. At the same time, he began to see Isabella as a tool. He exploited her obsession with him, using it as a key to move freely in and out of Thrushcross Grange, deliberately driving a wedge between Catherine and Linton, all while laying a trap within Isabella's desire. On the eve of their elopement, he took Isabella's beloved little spaniel and hanged it alive from a hook by the door, suspending it there with a handkerchief. Nellie rushed to take the dog down, saving its life just in time. Afterward, he described the scene to Nolly with a calm voice, even a hint of satisfaction. The first thing she saw when I walked out the door was the sight of me hanging her little dog. She begged me to let it go. And the first words out of my mouth were that I wished I could hang her whole family the same way. Isabella witnessed all of this with her own eyes, and still she followed him. Heathcliff never lied to her. He told her straight out that he had no feelings for her whatsoever, and that he only married her to manipulate her brother. He proved his cruelty through his actions, and declared his indifference through his words. But what Isabella heard was always a completely different script. She believed he was saying one thing and meaning another, believed she would be the exception. That wasn't stupidity. This is a deeper kind of tragedy. She simply could not imagine what true darkness looked like. She had grown up in a greenhouse world, and the worst thing she had ever witnessed was her brother snatching away a puppy. Every romantic novel she had ever read told her that a charming bad boy could be transformed by love, and so she truly believed it, giving up her entire youth in pursuit of that belief. After the wedding, Isabella quickly came face to face with reality. Her letters to Nellie were filled with despair. The once bright and beautiful young woman had become Heathcliff's battered, bedraggled wife, worn down by abuse and neglect. She went from wanting Heathcliff dead to slowly wishing she herself were dead, until she finally came to her senses better to let him rot on his own than to stay tangled up with him any longer. Hindley, consumed by rage, severed all ties with his sister. Catherine fell completely apart. She locked herself in her room, refusing to eat, and began pulling feathers from her pillow, one by one, then faster and faster, in a frenzy, until feathers filled the entire room. She identified each feather one by one, this one from a turkey, this one from a wild duck, this one from a pigeon, then piled them all on the bed. She let herself sleep, buried in that pile of feathers. She sank into a delusion, convinced she was still a wild child running free across the moors, convinced that all those years had never happened. Brain fever. That was what Victorian medicine called this kind of mental collapse. The reality was this: a person torn in two, forcing herself to survive in two incompatible worlds until she simply couldn't hold on any longer. The paradise of civilization had crushed her. She never truly recovered after that. Her body, through the long years of waiting for someone to return, fell apart piece by piece. It was the spring of 1784, an ordinary morning. Linton had gone to church. Heathcliff pushed open the door of the Grange and walked straight to Catherine's bedroom. They had been apart for nearly half a year. Nellie later recorded the scene. Heathcliff took 1 or 2 steps toward her and held her tightly in his arms. For about 5 minutes, neither of them said a word. 5 minutes. 5 minutes of silence. In that silence lived everything that could never be said out loud, every misheard word, every sentence left unfinished, every year that slipped away, everything that should never have happened. Heathcliff looked at her skin and bones, eyes vacant and hollow, this woman who had once burned like wildfire across the moors, worn away bit by bit by civilization and waiting. Heathcliff held her so fiercely that her arm bore 4 dark bruises, the shape of 4 fingers, clear and unmistakable. This was how he loved her and how he destroyed her. Then Catherine spoke. She said, "How long do you intend to live after I am gone?" No one knows whether it was a curse or a declaration of love. Perhaps it was both. Heathcliff knelt there, and Catherine gripped his hair, refusing to let him rise. The two of them tormented each other like children, yet clung together with desperate ferocity, like two people on the verge of a final parting. He begged her spirit, when she was gone, to haunt him, to never let go. "You have abandoned yourself," he said. "So what if you die before me? What does it matter? Do you honestly think I could just sit there peacefully in the world you leave behind after your death, suffering, surviving?" At that very moment, Linton returned from the church and walked in on the scene. A violent confrontation erupted between the two men. Catherine, caught between these two men, had already completely shattered in spirit. That night, Catherine gave birth to a baby girl. 2 hours later, she was gone. She was only 18 years old. Emily Bront died at 30, never having experienced love herself. Her Catherine dies at 18, consumed ahead of her time by the weight of loving and being loved. Linton named his daughter Catherine, and to tell them apart, people called her Little Cathy. When Heathcliff learned of Catherine's death, he collapsed outside, face down on the ground, only one phrase left on his lips: "No, don't let her go like this." He slammed his head against the tree trunk again and again, blood streaming down his forehead. This man, who never shed a tear, howled beneath that tree for an entire night. Then, in the dead of darkness, he walked alone to Catherine's grave. He threw himself across the freshly mounded earth, clawing at the soil with his bare hands, howling into the cold wind that swept across the moors, begging her spirit to haunt him, to stay, to find no peace. Don't leave him alone in this world. The darkness offered no answer. This man, who had always been indifferent to pain, broke down right there, before a mound of fresh earth. That same year, Isabella fled Wuthering Heights and settled near London, where she soon gave birth to Heathcliff's son, whom she named Linton Heathcliff. She never returned to the north again. A few months later, Hindley died, consumed by drink and debt, at just 27 years old. In his final days, he had attempted to shoot Heathcliff with a pistol, only to be overpowered. But this confrontation was not the direct cause of his death. It was the years of alcohol and self-destruction that had finally drained him completely. Heathcliff became the master of Wuthering Heights. It was the autumn of 1784. In his hands, he had already seized the branches of two great trees. One was Hindley, withered now. The other was Linton. For that one, he was willing to wait. It was at this very moment that he lifted Hareton up onto the table. The boy was Hindley's son, and now he had become his prey. He hooked the child's chin with his finger and said softly, "What a fine boy. You belong to me now, at last. Let's see for ourselves whether this sapling will grow just as twisted and crooked as the other one. Let the fierce winds twist its branches and trunk, it'll toughen up just fine." That was his philosophy. Whatever you did to me, I'll do the same to your child. Passed down from generation to generation, turning suffering into inheritance. The second generation's game begins with a letter. More than a decade later, Linton sheltered young Cathy within the walls of Thrushcross Grange, watching over her with careful, anxious devotion, keeping her well away from Wuthering Heights. But young Cathy was filled with curiosity about the moors and the world beyond. One day, out riding, she happened to cross paths with Hareton, and then by chance met Linton, who had been brought back from London. Before Isabella passed away, she sent young Linton back to the north of England. Linton took in this pale, sickly child, one who always looked at the world through sorrowful eyes, hoping to give him a stable home. But the moment Heathcliff learned he had a son, he seized the boy without hesitation. Not out of fatherly love, out of cold calculation. Though Linton was his own flesh and blood, Heathcliff couldn't stand the sight of him. The boy was weak, sickly, always whimpering, nothing like his father in any way. He poured every ounce of humiliation he had suffered over the years onto young Linton, but the boy was a pawn through him. Wuthering Heights could be seized, and Thrushcross Grange brought within reach. Heathcliff waited for the right moment, then arranged for Linton and young Cathy to exchange secret letters, quietly orchestrating meetings between the two. That pale, sickly boy, always gazing at people with those sorrowful eyes, had become nothing more than a pawn on his chessboard. Little Cathy was genuinely devoted to Linton. It was simply in her nature to be kind. When her father and Nellie fell ill at the same time, she stretched herself in two directions, tending to both of them with the utmost care. As for young Linton's feelings toward her, they were less true affection than a clinging dependence driven by fear of his father. When Linton lay on his deathbed, Heathcliff lured young Cathy and Nellie into Wuthering Heights and locked the doors. Cathy was kept prisoner there for nearly 5 days. She had fought back through negotiation, through trading sincerity for sincerity. But before a man whose very instinct is to plunder, the spirit of a covenant means nothing. Linton died alone, with no daughter by his side. Young Cathy, held captive, was forced to marry Linton. Heathcliff's second-generation revenge scheme was now complete. Linton died within weeks of the marriage, and the Thrushcross Grange estate passed into Heathcliff's hands. At last, both manor houses were his. He had won. Everyone lay crushed beneath his feet. Hindley was dead. Linton was dead. And both estates were his. Over the course of 30 years, he collected every debt owed to him one by one. He summoned a force of will greater than any man alive, sustaining his hatred for 30 years, realizing his blueprint for revenge, one step at a time. But the victor stands amid the ruins and finds he has nothing at all. This is the greatest tragedy of Wuthering Heights and its most profound insight. When revenge is complete, hatred has nowhere left to go. When the goal disappears, life loses its gravity. Heathcliff lived for decades, sustained by nothing but hatred. Hatred was his fuel, and it was his purpose. Once hatred is satisfied, he no longer knows where to go. Heathcliff stands in the midst of his victory and feels nothing but a bone-deep emptiness. Meanwhile, something small and quiet was taking root amid the ruins. Young Cathy and Hareton lived under the same roof, and slowly, their hostility began to give way to something gentler. At first, they despised each other. Young Cathy mocked Hareton's ignorance, and Hareton met her arrogance with nothing but roughness and spite. But time is both a force that wears things down and a force that brings them together. They discovered that they were both victims of this long tragedy, both crushed to the bottom of fate by that man named Heathcliff, left with no choices whatsoever. The reconciliation began with a book. Young Cathy placed a book in front of Hareton as a peace offering, and as an invitation, "Let me teach you to read. I won't make fun of you anymore." Hareton took the book and stared at it for a long time. He had wanted to learn to read before, but Heathcliff had never allowed it. He was a man who could not even write his own name in full, rough and unlettered in the eyes of others, a secret shame buried deep within himself. He had tried to teach himself, once secretly tracking down a book, cracking it open somewhere no one could see, sounding out the letters one by one. Cathy caught him in the act and laughed at him. That moment was enough. He put the book away and never touched it again. Now, someone was willing to teach him. They started with the alphabet, learning each letter one by one, sounding each one out. Little Cathy smiled, and Hareton smiled with her. The pages turned, and the wall between two souls came down, one brick at a time. Heathcliff watched all of this from the sidelines. He wanted to stop it, but found he couldn't summon the strength, because in them he saw Catherine. Not a hallucination, but a fact. Hareton and young Cathy both had eyes that were the exact image of Catherine's. In chapter 33, the words burst from his lips. Their eyes. They are unmistakably the eyes of Catherine Earnshaw. He tells Nellie that Hareton is the ghost of my immortal love. Every time he looked at these two young people, he did not see the descendants of his enemies, he saw Catherine. That light he had spent his whole life chasing, shining through another pair of young faces. That light undid him completely. Not just the eyes. He could no longer eat because the colors of food reminded him of her. He could no longer look at the trees outside the window because the way they swayed in the wind reminded him of her. He could not sleep, for her face haunted the darkness. Everything was her. He lost all interest in the outside world, the estates, the properties, the intricate chess game of revenge, all of it suddenly stripped of meaning. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. Nellie recorded her observations of him. Your cheeks are hollow, your eyes bloodshot like a man being starved and deprived of sleep. He began to mutter, speaking to the empty air, calling out Catherine's name. He felt her close by, just around the corner, just next door, just one step through the door away. He walked into one room, found her absent, then moved to the next, and the next after that. Through every corner of that great manor house he wandered, searching for a woman who had been dead 18 years. On the very day Linton was laid to rest, he came alone to Catherine's grave. He bribed the gravedigger to pry open the lid of a coffin that had been sealed for 18 years. That face, to his eyes, looked little different from when she had been alive. He stood by the grave for a long time, long enough that the gravedigger had to urge him to leave. Before leaving, he pried loose a side panel of the coffin. He told Nellie afterward, "Not Linton's side, damn it, not Linton's side." That side, the side facing where he himself would one day lie. He wanted their bones, deep in the earth, to quietly draw close together. One night, he locked himself inside the bedroom where Catherine used to sleep. He opened the window. The cold winds of the Yorkshire moors rushed in against his face, rain beating down on the floor, beating down on him. He did not close the window. The next morning, Nellie went to check on him. He lay in bed, eyes wide open, a strange smile at the corners of his mouth. The rain had soaked him through. He was no longer bleeding. The man who had spent his whole life walking through violence and hatred had finally come to a stop. This is how Heathcliff dies, not in tragedy, not in redemption, but in a strange and quietly contented exhaustion. While he lived, he was one of the most powerful men in the world. When he died, he took nothing with him, nothing but himself. As he had wished, he was buried beside Catherine. He lies to her left, Linton to her right, and Catherine rests between them. Three souls, entangled across a lifetime, found their final rest in this way, bound together forever. And with Heathcliff's death, the long tangled web of property rights unraveled on its own. Young Cathy, as the last surviving heir of the Lintons, inherited Thrushcross Grange. Hareton, as Hindley's son, reclaimed Wuthering Heights as his own. The empire Heathcliff spent his entire life building quietly crumbled with his death. The properties returned to their rightful owners. That new year, young Cathy and Hareton set their wedding date, with plans to move into Thrushcross Grange. Their love carried none of the world-shattering intensity that burned between Heathcliff and Catherine, nor the gentle, one-sided devotion that Edgar Linton had offered Catherine. Instead, it is something real, equal, mutual, chosen freely, a closeness they still lean into even after everything they have suffered. Their story was the only light in this long and harrowing tragedy. Lockwood, the outsider who had rented Heathcliff's house at the very beginning of our story, made one final pass by the three gravestones before taking his leave. Right there by the graveyard, he came across a young shepherd boy, weeping. The boy looked up and said, "Don't go that way, sir. There are the ghosts of Heathcliff and a woman out there, sir, wandering in the night." Wuthering Heights, after all was said and done, returned once more to silence. Today, more than 170 years have passed since Emily Bronte's death. Wuthering Heights was first printed in a run of only 250 copies and was met with widespread condemnation. Critics called it morally depraved and said the author should have killed herself before writing such a book. No one saw what was coming next. In 1926, legal scholar C.P. Sanger did something rather unusual. He read Wuthering Heights the way a lawyer reads a case file, reconstructing every timeline with surgical precision. Ages of marriage, rights of inheritance, transfer of property, not a single detail out of place. A woman who had never received any formal legal education, writing from a study on the moors, produced a work whose narrative logic was utterly beyond reproach. In 1934, David Cecil was the first to make a systematic case for its vindication. Virginia Woolf wrote, "Emily is a greater poet than Charlotte. 170 years on trial, not guilty." When that 16-inch narrow coffin was carried out of Haworth Parsonage, the undertaker said he had made coffins his whole life. He had never seen such a narrow adult coffin. The person inside was 30 years old and had never loved anyone, but she wrote these words, "Love is the eternal rock beneath your feet and the overwhelming force that destroys everything." It is 5 minutes of silence, It is 4 bruised fingerprints on an arm. It is a window left open on a rainy night. Love cannot save a soul that is rotten at its core. But from the ruins, 2 tender shoots still grew. Young, Kathy, and Harriton. Their love didn't shake the heavens or shatter the earth. It started with the alphabet, 1 letter at a time, slowly taking down the wall between them, brick by brick. This, too, is an answer to love. At the very beginning, I asked, that love, which turned you into a demon, was it true love, or was it obsession? Heathcliff spent his whole life calling out, and never found the answer. Not because the answer didn't exist. It's because, in certain kinds of love, true love and obsession are one and the same thing. Love deeply enough, and the line between them simply disappears. You didn't lose true love because of obsession. You developed that obsession because the love was real. And finally, I'd like to leave you with a question. Over the years, have you ever loved someone so deeply that you burned yourself into a completely different person? Maybe it wasn't 30 years. Maybe it was just staying in a relationship you couldn't quite call right, or waiting for far too long, knowing full well how it would end, and yet choosing to stay anyway. And afterward, you ask yourself, was that love, or was it just obsession? So my question now is, if between true love and obsession there was never a clear line from the very beginning, would you be willing to love again? I'm Fanko. Once again, thank you all for spending so much time with me today. I look forward to seeing your answers in the comments. See you in the next book.